delighted to be here today and to introduce a friend and mentor of mine. I also hope that this microphone is something we can put back into a normal position when I'm done talking. Father Richard J. Clifford of the Society of Jesus is a native of Lewiston, Maine, and serves, as we heard, at the School of Theology and Ministry as a professor of Old Testament. He's a graduate of Boston College, where he received his bachelor's and a master's. He received the licentiate in sacred theology at Weston Jesuit School of Theology in one of its first years of existence. He graduated with a degree in Near Eastern language and culture from Harvard University, and then he returned to Weston in 1964. He remained there as a professor of biblical studies until 2008. In 2007-2008, he served as president of Weston Jesuit School of Theology, and he was the founding dean of BC's School of Theology and Ministry, serving in that capacity from 2008 until 2010. His great love of teaching drew him away from those administrative jobs, however, and back to the classroom and to research. Father Clifford's professional scholarly interests include the ancient Near Eastern background of the Bible, biblical wisdom literature, especially the Psalms, about which he is one of the leading scholars of the field. His research also includes work on the opening books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. Many of us who preach and teach are indebted to him for his articles on Genesis and Exodus in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary. His other research interest, the interpretation of the Christian Bible in contemporary culture, is what brings us here today. In addition to his work as teacher and scholar, Father Clifford has given many hours of service to his fellow scholars. He was general editor of the Catholic Biblical Quarterly for many years and is a former president of the Catholic Biblical Association. Among his recent publications are a 2012 revision with his friend and recently departed colleague, Daniel Harrington, of the book Reading the Old Testament, an Introduction, which, by the way, is available by the door for anyone who is interested. He's also the author of many articles for scholarly journals and popular magazines. In addition to teaching and lecturing in scholarly circles, Father Clifford is also active in adult education in various places around New England. Among his recent contributions to those of us who work with adults is a 24-lecture DVD series entitled Enjoying the Old Testament, published by Now You Know Media. When he is not at work, Father Clifford enjoys hiking, reading, and classical music, especially opera. I can speak to this last one personally. My office is right across from his at the School of Theology and Ministry. Our dean always announces new publications by the faculty, and when the announcement is about Father Clifford, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that each time, earlier that day, Pavarotti's Nessun Dorma wafted across the hall. It is my very great pleasure to introduce you to my teacher and mentor, Professor Richard Clifford, who will speak to us today about finding our place in the story of the Bible.
Thank you, Michael, for your kind words, and the microphone does return to its original place, which I'm sure everyone is happy about. So I would like to talk today about finding your place in the Christian Bible, and the reason that I am talking is I can give a couple of anecdotes. One is, last year I was at a scholarly conference where there were many Christians and Jews, and one of the Jewish scholars there said something that really surprised me. He said, the biggest hijacking of all time has been the Christian taking of the Old Testament. And I bit my tongue, not wanting to, not wanting to interrupt the proceedings, but it just struck me as a very odd thing to say, given that the Christians who interpreted the scriptures, especially in the formative years, were all of them completely Orthodox Jews. There is also, on the Christian side, something that I think makes necessary a talk of this kind. many of us, I think Catholics among Christians are notorious for their not reading the Bible. There's many exceptions to that, but I think the generalization is somewhat true. And in the old lectionary, prior to the revision of the lectionary that we now use, there was not a single reading from the Old Testament in the Sunday readings. It's hard to believe that that was the case, but that was the case. And even among us, after 50 years after Dei Verbum, at the Apostolic Constitution and the Vatican Council, many of us still are only somewhat acquainted with the Old Testament. But so I would like to help us understand the Old Testament by really drawing attention to the story that runs through it from the book of Genesis to the book of Revelation. And there's nothing easier to understand, to pique one's interest than a good story. And so I'm going to emphasize the story that is especially visible in the Christian Bible, and I'm going to also suggest ways of reading the Christian Bible so that story remains paramount in our consciousness. The Old Testament, as I mentioned before, really belongs fully to Jews and to Christians alike. It's really a shared testament. It's one of those happy things that unite Christians and Jews. And both of the earliest interpretations of the scriptures among Jewish interpreters and among Christian interpreters took place at about the same broad period of time. We'll see a little bit more about that in a moment. The Christian tradition has, especially in modern times, relatively modern times, has tended to emphasize the predictive quality of the Old Testament. In other words, the Old Testament is revered among Christians partly because it predicts the New Testament. So that if there was some other substitute for the Old Testament as predicting, people might use that instead. But the Old Testament stands on its own and really is able to make its own case, not only by predicting, but by telling a story that continues into the New Testament. So chapter 4 in Dei Verbum talks about the Old Testament, but it tends to overemphasize the predictive quality of it. And it says, in fact, it says that the Old Testament is designed, above all, to prepare for the coming of Christ. Well, I think we can say it does that, but it has its own value in addition to its predictive value. I'm not criticizing Dei Verbum, which came out in 1965, but because it didn't go beyond where Catholics were at the time, and no one expects a conciliar document to pioneer, but it did give us the state of the question at the time. But I think we have gone beyond that, even in official documents since that time. What I'd like to do is to talk about to begin to talk about the Old Testament by comparing it with the Jewish Testament, which the preferred term for Jews for the Old Testament, for what we would call the Old Testament, is Tanakh. And as you can see, Tanakh here is an acronym. It's like NASA and other acronyms that we are used to. The word T stands for the first part of the three parts of the Jewish Bible. It stands for Torah. And under Torah, we find in the Jewish Bible our Pentateuch, what Christians tend to call the Pentateuch, although Jews use that term as well. You will find the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that is the core of the Jewish Bible. It's very central to the Jewish understanding of their own scriptures because they read there the Exodus, which is the formation of the Jewish people, and also particularly the law that is given at Sinai through the mediation of Moses. The Mosaic covenant is, again, central in Judaism. And so if you look at the Jewish Bible as a core, as a central core of the Torah, then surrounded by another core, things as the prophets, and then finally the writings. So the Torah is there, the T. The N stands for Nevi'im, which is the Hebrew word for prophets. And in Judaism, the prophets are divided into the former prophets and the latter prophets. The former prophets are what Christians would call Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the historical books. And the latter prophets are what Christians would agree with their Jewish colleagues as the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. And then you have the outer circle is the writings. And this includes everything else, those things that have been written down, the Psalms, Job, Proverbs, the Song of Solomon, the book of Daniel, and so on. But you can see that what the prophets are, the reason that the prophets are in the next circle is because they are considered to be explanatory of the Torah. The prophets, the former prophets, the books, the historical books, talk about what happens if you obey or disobey the central core, the Sinai covenant. And so they're kind of pointing there, helping you understand the daily implications of that wonderful revelation that is given at Sinai. And the historical books that are called prophets illustrate what happens if you obey and are faithful to that Sinai covenant and to the Lord who made it, gave it, and what happens if you aren't. Whereas the outer core, the writings, are less immediately oriented to the Torah, but they do explicate it, they celebrate it, they talk about aspects of it. So you can see that there's a kind of centralizing, a central focus to the Tanakh. Now, if you look to the Christian Bible, you will also find three parts, but there's a little different orientation to the Christian Bible, and that is the Pentateuch and the historical books. So you have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, plus Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, are called the historical books because in the Christian understanding, there is a tendency to regard the beginning of Genesis 1 as a story, the beginning of the story. So the story continues, and instead of stopping and focusing on the Sinai covenant and the Exodus, the story keeps on going. And it finally, at least in the Pentateuch, ends in the book of Deuteronomy. But it continues with Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and then in the Christian arrangement, Chronicles, and then Maccabees. So that's the first part of the Christian Bible, is a story that goes right down to almost the time of the New Testament. Then in the middle of the Christian Bible, you have part two, and that is the wisdom literature. And the wisdom literature consists, as you know, of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and as well as in the Catholic and Orthodox count, it would be, Greek Orthodox, it would be Sirach and Wisdom of Solomon, plus some others. And then finally, at the end of the Christian Bible, part three are the prophets. And the Christian intent is to see in the prophets foretellers of the time of Christ. And it is significant that the last book of the Old Testament that you read prior to beginning the New is the book of Malachi. So the book of Malachi ends, and then the book of Matthew begins. So in the Christian understanding, the prophets there are more foretellers. They're foretelling the final age that comes, they believe, with the coming of Jesus. So you can see there's a little different orientation. We, Christians and Jews, share the same number of books, and Protestant canon and the Jewish canon are the same. In the Catholic and Orthodox canon, there are some additional books. But I think what chiefly distinguishes both is, and we'll deal with this in the future, is that there is a kind of orientation to the future in the Christian Bible toward a culmination or toward a climax, whereas in the Jewish Bible, that is not true. So I just wanted to begin by, I think it helps us by comparing the Tanakh and the Christian Bible. It helps us understand some of the important emphases in the Christian Bible. So, having done that, we'll move on to the first chapter of the Christian Bible and of the Jewish Bible as well. Let's see, that shouldn't, the first chapter of the Bible. Genesis chapter 1, 1:1 to 2:3. And I will analyze this a little bit more than most of the other chapters, because in the Christian understanding, Genesis 1 is taken not only as the majestic portrayal of God's created world, that God declares 7 times to be good. It is also in the Christian Bible, in a sense, the first day of the story of the world. And let's just look at that a little bit more clearly. So we can see that you have You have 6 days of creation. I'm just going to go very briefly here. And you have, in panel 1, you have the 3 domains of earth, sea, and sky, and they are created. And then in the second panel, on the other side, you will see a kind of matchup that in each one of the mobile inhabitants of each one of these 3 domains is portrayed. And then in the day 6, humans come in, and that's us. And then at the end, God ceases from creation. God rests from creation. Doesn't take it's not quite the same as taking a day off. God ceases to work is what it means. And it's a hint to us that this really is a story about God. It's not a story about us. We only come in on the 6th day. The 7th day is the climactic one. And so the story begins very majestically with this very serene and serenely created world in which everything is ordered and everything is beautiful. And at the very end of it, we see God declaring it very, very good, and then ceasing to work because no more work is necessary. The thing is complete, it's beautiful, and it's final. There is, however, something missing in day 1, in this week, and I won't ask you what it is because you'd probably take a while to guess at it. But what's missing is human sin. The Bible is very realistic about discussing human beings, and normally it talks about humans and their limits, and humans and their follies, as well as humans and their grandeur. But what's missing in this story, in this particular picture, is any sign that this is a defaced or diminished creation. This is creation as it comes fresh from the hand of God. And I like to paraphrase the familiar glory be prayer. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. And to say, this is a portrait as it was in the beginning, is not now, but will be forever. So what it is not only a description of the first day, which you might call a protology, that is the protos, the first thing. It's also an eschatology, because what we're looking at now is an orderly world that God brought into being, and we know as human beings that it's not going to stay that way for very long once humans are on the scene, but it will be at the end. And so this is really a depiction of what God intended, and as we know from the Bible and how God works through the world, this will be the final state of the world. It will be what God intends, even though humans rebel and put obstacles in the way. So it's significant, I think, that in the Christian Bible, the book of Revelation, chapter 21, is almost the end of it, because there we have a new creation that will be permanent and will be brilliantly lit up by the presence of God. And that will be the final thing to which we look forward. And that is so this is a kind of protology. It's a opening salvo of what God intended and what God did, and it is also a hint of what will be at the end. So God will be triumphant at the end. So this is, I think, a very appropriate way for the Christian Bible to begin with creation and end with a renewed and definitive creation, the world to come, so to speak. Okay, so I'm just going to say a couple of things further about this, because they will bear on the question of story. When God makes the human, Robert Alter translates man there as the human, and I think it's not a bad translation. He says that, okay, God speaks to the human, and God gives 2 commands to human beings, 2 commands that define what they will be and what they will do. And the first is be fertile and multiply, or be fertile and increase, which means that our duty is, as human beings, to increase in number. Our mortality is assumed, and the antidote for mortality in the Bible is to generate another generation. So the first duty of humans, therefore, is to see to the next generation, to increase and multiply. And the second is fill the earth and subdue it. And now this is a disputed phrase, but I will give you my understanding of it at any rate. And you can ask Father Simone for his understanding of it. It might not be the same. But it is basically each one of you as nations have a particular territory, and I expect you to go to that land and to use that land to nurture you, to give you clothing, and to give you food. So it really means to take the land that I want you to have. That's what the two things are. So the Genesis 2 to 9, if you just keep on going, now we're just talking about the so-called primeval history in chapters 1 to 11. Genesis chapters 2 to 9 are largely concerned with progeny. That is, it shows the progress of human beings. It shows the genealogies that so-and-so begat, begat, begat. That shows the human race is spreading. People are increasing in number, and the world is being filled with people. And so, but then at the chapters 10 and 11, it talks about the land that is going to be assigned to each one of the 70 nations. So we can see a kind of drama being built up as we're going to hear about how humans will behave and conduct themselves, and also how they will take their lands. These defining comparatives help structure the primeval history and what happens to the ancestors and even the Pentateuch itself. Now, I just want to say a word about the Pentateuch because right now, but we'll talk about it later as a story. But I just want to, most scholars, just about every scholar that I know, is convinced that the Pentateuch that we have, that is the 5 books that structure the very core of the Bible, were composed for an audience of people who were exiled from their own land. People who were exiled against their will to Babylon, to Egypt, and to other cities after the destruction of the city in 586 BC. There are people, therefore, that we can imagine easily saying to themselves, what future do we have as a people? We've been scattered. We were clearly God's holy nation of Israel when we lived in that particular land, but here we are all over the place. We hardly know our neighbors. We don't speak the language. We're ill at ease in this environment that we never chose. And we also don't believe we will ever get back to our land, our beloved land, because it's now populated by other people. So the Pentateuch, therefore, is designed to address people with this rather depressing set of thoughts by telling them that God intends the human race to continue in existence. Therefore, that would be a very positive message to a group of people who are wondering whether they have any future. And God also intends that each nation take and keep its own land. So this would be a very encouraging message to an exiled population. And so one of the things to keep in your mind in reading the Pentateuch is to recognize that while these traditions are probably, most of them, very old, before the exile, nonetheless, the editing of them has been done during the exile, and it is designed for people who really are dispirited and who are doubtful that they have a future and that they will ever return to their native land. So the book, therefore, is good news, the Pentateuch, for them. All right, I'd like to bring up I told you that I was going to talk about the story. And in talking about the story that continues through the Bible, at least in the Christian understanding of it, there is a particular device that helps us keep on track and helps us to remember that this is a story with a particular goal. And the means to do that is called traditionally typology. Now, typology is not a concept of mathematics. It is a concept of mathematics, but it's not the meaning it is here. I tend to translate it into a modern term called cross-referencing. In other words, there's going to be a deliberate attempt by the various storytellers to to say something that has a resonance or a quotation or a citation backwards and also something forwards. And I'll give you some examples in a moment here, if I can. Okay, the typology is a term that has long been used it's found in the New Testament itself when Paul says that Adam was a type of Christ. You know, Adam, the man who disobeyed and brought death into the world, according to Paul. And then Jesus is the man who obeyed and brought life into the world. Okay, so Adam is the type, and Jesus is the antitype. That is to say, the corresponding element. So the fathers of the church used this constantly, and in fact, they somewhat overused it in the opinion of many people. But the Bible itself does it. Now, there's a couple of things here. For example, there's an example of the crossing of the Red Sea, according to St. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, is a type of baptism. In other words, Israel went through the sea in order to gain freedom and emerge liberated from Pharaoh and ready to live in the promised land. So also the waters of baptism does the same for you. It liberates you from your sin, it forgives your sins, and it also enables you to live together as a new people in Christian freedom. Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and then was spewed up on the beach. So Jesus was in the belly of the earth 3 days and rose from the dead. So you can say those are types that you find in the New Testament. They're sanctioned by the Scripture itself. But what is not realized, I think, is that typology or cross-referencing occurs all over the Bible, and it occurs within what we call the Old Testament. For example, here's a couple of examples. In the story of Abraham, the first story that we really hear about about Abraham is in chapter 12 of Genesis. And Abraham and his wife Sarah, they're called at this point they have their older names, Abram and Sarai. They are caught in a famine in the land of Canaan, today contemporary Israel, and they go to Egypt because Egypt doesn't depend on rain, it depends on the Nile, so they can buy grain in Egypt. When they go down there, just before they go, Abram says to his wife, I hear that Pharaoh takes every beautiful woman that he sees and brings her to his harem. So in order for me to save my skin, I'm going to ask you to say you are my sister. This is not one of Abraham's great moments, you can tell. I think you might, if you were related to Abraham, you might, especially if you were at Sarah's side of the family, you might say that's not a very good thing to do. But they do it, and it's clearly meant to show Abraham's lack of faith at this point in his life. And so they go there, and sure enough, Pharaoh sees Sarai, she's a beautiful woman, and he takes her into his harem. But then he finds out that she is married, and he is afraid of incurring divine wrath, so he gets rid of it. He gets angry at Abram, sends him off, but he sends him off with presents so that he doesn't take any revenge on him. Well, what does that say? That is actually a figure or a type or a cross-reference to the later incidents when Israel as a people, the Hebrews, will be in Egypt, and they are going to be chased out of, the Pharaoh is going to finally let them go, but they borrow silver and gold from their neighbors, and so they go spoliare Egyptos, as the Latin phrase goes. They take the spoil of Egypt because it's really owed to them by the slavery, and they leave. So you can see that when you see Abram and Sarah, it reminds you of, wait a minute, these people are so representative that they are prefiguring something that's going to happen to their descendants later on. Now, what does this do for you? It seems to me it gives you, the reader, the sense that there's a plan operating here. Abram and Sarai know nothing. They don't know it. They don't know they're actors in a broader drama than they can conceive of. I'll give you another example. Moses, Joseph, he's not a patriarch in the sense of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he's a great hero in the latter part of the book of Genesis. He is a literal shepherd. He's a shepherd boy, 17-year-old kid out there with a sheep. He thinks he has these two dreams, and his brothers hate him because he says the dreams mean they're bowing down before him as a ruler. And in a family of 12 sons, that you don't do. Well, he does. Clueless little guy. And so his brothers then, they're about to kill him, but they decide they don't want to shed blood. So they throw him into a pit, and they tell him, they take his beautiful coat, his cloak, and they sell this boy in his underwear, a 17-year-old boy, to a passing band of Arab traders, where he's sold into slavery in Egypt. So he goes into Egypt. He's forced out of his own family. He marries, he eventually does well. He marries the daughter of a priest and has 2 sons. And then he returns to his land, but he returns this time as a metaphorical shepherd, that is to say, a ruler. And he is able to save the family. Okay. So Moses comes along a little bit after Joseph. Moses is forced to flee because the Egyptians realize that he has killed an Egyptian. And so he's a most wanted. He leaves. He marries the daughter of a priest. And he goes, he was a shepherd, and he's a shepherd. He becomes a shepherd. He marries the daughter of a priest. He then goes to the mountains and Sinai and is given a commission, and then returns as a metaphorical shepherd to lead his people to freedom. Okay, so you have 2 people. Do you think that Joseph knew anything about Moses? Or do you think Moses knew anything about Joseph? No. You, the reader, however, know there is a divine plan operating because you can see the clues. But these people are operating in much more darkness than you are. So there's often in the Bible what is called the biblical irony, that actors in the Bible sometimes do things or say things that have a far greater import than they realize, precisely because there is a divine plan operating without detection, moving the story forward. Okay, I give some other examples that I won't go into, but you can, I think, see them. They were in they're in the handout that you have too. So there's the typology, the cross-referencing. And I guess I've already said that the actors know the implication. So let's just look now, having seen some of the mechanisms by which the story is advanced and mechanisms that help you realize there's a single story going on, let's go to the Pentateuch and just make some remarks about segments of them. And then we'll have a chance to, let me see, we started at, okay, I think we'll just go about 10 more minutes and we'll have some time for you to ask each other questions and then you to ask questions while the break. So, primeval history, the story from Genesis 2 to 11. Here, I just wanted to point out something. There's a million things I could point out. I could talk about the man and the woman in the garden, and we could end next at Shrove Tuesday, and there'd still be more to say, but we'll have to ration our comments. But I wanted to just to say that when God makes creates the man and the woman, and we see the man and the woman, later we know them as Adam and Eve, in the garden, they sin, their son, Cain, kills Abel, so the human race is getting off to a very shaky and violent start. God forgives them, but also begins to wonder about the wisdom of creating in the first place. We find in a very shocking statement, twice repeated in chapter 6, God saying, I made a mistake. I should never have done this. Now, here is the omniscient God, who is allegedly supposed to see everything in the future, coming to the conclusion that he made a mistake. And I think it's not a violation of divine omniscience. Rather, it shows the willingness of God to create a free being and then really allow that being freedom to move and be willing to respond appropriately as that person or that group of persons make their own way through the world. So what God sees, though, is not encouraging and decides to wipe the human race out. What prevents God from wiping out everybody by the flood in this chapter 6 to 8 is the sight of one person who is righteous, Noah. And how can a righteous God destroy a righteous person? Everybody else, apparently, in this kind of very almost cartoon-like way of depicting reality, everyone else is wicked, but not Noah. God, in a sense, cannot destroy Noah. So decides, by looking at one person, decides to make a fresh start. So Noah survives the flood, and from his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, repopulates the earth and begins again. Now, it is my view, this is a completely personal view, but it's shared by a few people, I'm sure, that God got the idea for calling Abraham and Sarah by having relative success with Noah. In other words, the one it's easier to deal with one person or one family than it is to deal with thousands of families, right? And so I think God gets the idea that you can, in fact, reach the many through the one. And I think that is suggested to him by Noah. So Noah deserves a lot of credit. He kind of prefigures Abraham and Sarah, but he also, in a sense, gave God an idea. You know, this is putting it kind of simply, I agree, but I think that the possibility, therefore, of one person speaking or standing up for the many, and is, I think, the legacy of Noah. So the next thing that happens is the flood, and then there's a new creation. I'm not going to dwell very long on this, but I will say this about Abraham and Sarah. The nation, in chapters 10 and 11, God assigns, first of all, every one of the 70 nations gets a language and gets a territory to go to. And then in chapter 11, the people initially don't want to take the land. They hunker down and want to build a city, but God forces them to take their land by confusing their tongues so they can't cooperate on a single project. And is this all the nations of the world then, we have to imagine, are moving out to take possession of their lands. And only to one of these people moving out, God says to this person, go to a land that I will go to a land that I will show you. Leave your land, the land of your kin, and your father's house. All of these are very comforting notions, right? Your family, the land where your kin are. Leave those and go to a place that I will show you. And then Abraham and Sarah are to get what the nations have already. The nations are going to their land. He is told to go to a strange land, which he doesn't own, and he is also aware that the nations will have children in abundance. But he is married to a woman who is unable to have children, and he and her are well over the age of child rearing. So this is an extraordinary request of God, and Abraham does. He obeys. This is the first and great obedience of Abraham, that he's willing to take the chance to break away from the nation, so to speak, and allow God to determine the timetable, because he's always going to come afterwards. The nations will spread abroad, they will populate their lands, they will take them because they're all empty. There's no need to fight for the land. But here is this couple who are ancient. He's 75 years old, and his wife is just a few years younger. And he's going to have to wait 25 years for the promise to come true. And even at the end, he'll have one son that they can both claim as their son. And he'll have a burial cave that he paid an exorbitant price for to bury his wife. That's all they have. So they still have to wait. You can see the extraordinary demand that God makes of this person. To do, yeah, he'll be concerned with land and concerned with progeny, but the timetable is completely messed up. It's not at all like anybody else's. He's distinct, he's different, and this is the one that God will address the nations with, this unusual couple. And I'm going to say, when I say Abraham and Sarah, you can call them a family, but at the same time the Bible, because it's interested in the man who represents the family, focuses on Abraham for the most part. So that's going to be the story. And so God renews the covenant to their three families. Now, I'm just going to continue. I'm just going to quickly finish the story because I don't think I need to dwell on it too much. You've got the gist of it already. In the book of Genesis gives us the three generations of Abraham's family. Abraham and Sarah have Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah have Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons, and then the thing really segments into 12 children, 12 sons, who are the eponymous ancestors of later Israel. Quickly, just to do a little bit, to rush now through it, I'll just do it this way. What happens next is the family goes to Egypt. They are enslaved. The Pharaoh who knew Joseph dies, and a new Pharaoh comes onto the scene who tries to eliminate them, or at least reduce their numbers, and won't let them leave to go back to their land. God calls Moses. Moses, through 12 plagues, demonstrates the power of Yahweh over Pharaoh. And finally, they leave. They meet the Lord at Sinai. the people agree to be the Lord's people, and once they agree, God gives them the 10 Commandments, and then through Moses, the covenant code. They then journey all the way through the wilderness, which is a difficult journey and one fraught with temptations. But the Pentateuch ends, the book of Numbers tells us of the journey, but then the book of Deuteronomy tells us that when they arrive at Moab, which is in today Jordan, they haven't yet entered the Holy Land. But the Pentateuch ends with the people looking across the Jordan at the land that they are going to take tomorrow. And they must listen to Moses tell them how they are to live long in the land and how they are to live so as to win the blessing of the Lord, protection, long life, fertility, and basic happiness. And so that's the book of the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch ends as a narrative, not with the people in the land, but with the people outside the land looking to go into the land. And as a result, you can see how this would be a perfect ending or a credible ending for an exiled population. If the story ended happily with the people in the land, how would you feel if you read the story if you were in Babylon? You'd say, that's not my story at all. But if the book ends with the people looking at the land and readying themselves to go into it, someone in Egypt or Babylon could say, yeah, that makes sense. That's my story. I want to go back. I want to cross over. And I want to listen to the preaching of Moses to tell me how I am to live in this land so as to always be the Lord's people and to enjoy the Lord's blessing. So I just wanted to, just to sum up again, I promised at the beginning that I would focus on the storyline in the Old Testament, and I've focused only on the book on the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. But I wanted to underline that these first 5 books are many things, but one of the things that they are, and it's the one that I want to underline, is that it tells a story that begins with the creation of the world in Genesis 1, that continues on through Abraham's family, 3 generations, that goes into Egypt through enslavement, liberation, and community building in the book of Exodus, and then continues on a journey that ends on the plains of Moab, looking at the land but not possessing it. And that's where it ends. So my question to you is, and I'm asking if you would just turn to your neighbor or to your neighbors before we have an open question period and ask whether you can hear Moses say to you, which he said to the people on the plains of Moab, I call heaven and earth today to witness against you. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Choose life, then, that you and your descendants may live. Okay, so if you can you imagine yourself in the shoes, or the sandals, I guess you'd say, of those people as they look at the land while they're hearing Moses? So why don't we do that for 3 or 4 minutes just to, get your brains going, and then we can have questions until a little break. Okay. So now we're going to have about few minutes for questions, and because the room is big, we're going to ask you to wait for our 2 runners with microphones to reach you before you ask a question, just so that everyone will hear the question. So, any questions? Nothing is off limits. It doesn't mean I can answer them, but you could ask them.
Father, I wonder if you would comment on the origin of the book of Genesis. When you talk about the Persians and the Babylonians, what was God's plan for them? And I was thinking, too, no one took notes. No one was there in the beginning.
Right.
There was no one to write. So how did they know?
Okay, that's a very good question, and people have been asking it and answering it in various ways for a couple of millennia. Here's the one that I would give. I think that we know the genre or the kind of literature that Genesis 1 to 11 is, and we've known it for several decades, and the reason is because we have recovered a particular epic from Mesopotamia, which is today Iraq, written in about 16 to 1700 BC. The name of the story is Atrahasis, And the story is pretty much the same in general outline as Genesis 1 to 11. I'll just give you the story. The story in Atrahasis begins with just the gods. The only living things were the gods. But the gods were divided into an upper class of 3 or 4 gods who held all the power, and a lower class of gods who did all the menial work of keeping the canals clean and providing food for the gods and building their houses and that sort of thing. Finally, those gods go on strike, and so the high gods accede to that and decide that they will create a new creature to do the dirty work that the lower class of gods no longer want to do. So they kill the chief rebel god, and from his blood and from clay, they make a new creature called humans. And humans fill the bill for up to 600 years, but finally exceed the capacity of the land to support them. And their noise and general raucousness keeps the gods awake and makes them angry. They decide to wipe out the human race through a flood, but one god, the god of wisdom who made them, and the mother goddess, like humans because they made them. And they tip off one human being to build an ark and ride out the flood. So the gods discover that after a few days, when the garbage is piling up and the canals are silting over and they are eating sandwiches instead of good meals, that they made a big mistake. And then they realize that, aha, there's one left. So they build a second edition of man, and the second edition includes childhood diseases, an order of women who do not marry and work in the temple area, but most importantly, mortality. And so the second edition of humans comes about after the flood. Okay, you can see how that really is the basic outline of Genesis 1 to 11. You have creation, fault, flood, new creation. But notice the difference. In Genesis, you have the fault is not the gods' misdesign. The fault is human malice. And the flood is sent not out of caprice by the gods, but as a punishment for injustice by the God, Yahweh, the Lord. And then when the flood subsides and the human race the human world is repopulated, there is no change in the original blessing. God doesn't have to revise anything. God, out of mercy, has allowed the human race to continue. So that gives us a scheme. So what do you infer from that? I would infer this, that basically when Genesis was being constructed and being edited, and obviously there were different sources, different traditions are being incorporated into one, that they had already a story that was widely current, that they could use and could retell in their own way. So we don't use stories for serious meaning. If we want to give a serious lecture, we give a lecture with 3 or 4 points and so on. And we might use an occasional story to illustrate a point. But they would use the story itself to give the meaning, which means that they're quite different from ourselves. So what I would say is that the story of flood, fault, creation, fault, flood, new creation, that general scheme, was already available as a kind of narrative template. That if you were a serious thinker, a theologian or a philosopher in that kind of world, you would use that story and tell it in a different way so as to get your points across, or get your values across. And so that's what I think the biblical writers did. They told a story that was familiar, and they assumed that the readers, especially of that period, could get the nuances provided by the shifts in the storyline. So in other words, we're not saying that this is historical, because no one was there in the flood. I mean, who would be there to tell us about the first 5 days? And even, so it doesn't make any sense. And we also know that there's some inconsistencies in the story. When Cain wanted to kill his brother Abel, why did he take him out into the field so that nobody would see him, when the only people, according to a strict story, was his father and mother? And there's and why would Cain then say, if I go to another place, people will see me and kill me, if there's just his parents left? So it's like an anthologizing. This is not to say it's not historical in a modern sense. It rather is representatively historic. It's so representative and catches so well the human condition that you can say it's true in that sense. But later on, you're going to have historical stories like the story of David and so on. That's a different world. And even the stories of Abraham and Sarah, that's a different world. But in those earlier period, I think that's what you have to say. It's a kind of a narrative template that would have been familiar to people at that point that could be told in different ways. And so that's my answer. That's a kind of a long answer, I agree, but it's a big question. There's one thing I just want to bring up, and what do you call the Old Testament? As you know, many of you have been in places where they've said the Hebrew Bible. And then other people say the First Testament, or the Prior Testament, or the Shared Testament, something like that. Well, and for us, why do they say that? Because old means, if you have an old car, you're looking around to buy a new one, right? You don't want an old car. Who wants to have an old car? Who wants to have an old refrigerator in their house? You want a new one. So that means the old has got to be discarded. That's the problem with old. On the other hand, and it's true also, that it was only at the end of the 2nd century, about 190, 200 AD, that people began to speak of the ancient scriptures as Old Testament. Before that, they called them the scriptures, or the law and the prophets. So that's here's the problem. The problem is Old Testament is traditional in Christianity from the 200 to the present. And yet it does have that problem of old meaning, gee, old and worn out. I still use Old Testament. Well, Hebrew, and the other thing, Hebrew Bible, nobody uses Hebrew Bible except people who work in universities where they have to be politically correct, so that's another problem there. I would say I follow people like Amy Jill Levine and John Levinson, both Jewish scholars who know a lot about the Christian Bible and a lot about Christianity and are very friendly to the Christian church. They would say you can use it, but the only thing you have to not do is to advocate supersessionism. And supersessionism is a long Latin-based word that means to supersede. So that if you say, we are the new Israel, you can't say, God has rejected Israel. And it's Catholic doctrine really now, as in Pope John Paul II, and it's implied really it's implied in Romans chapter 9 to 11, that God never walks away from a covenant. God made an agreement and will always honor the agreement made with the heirs of Abraham who are Jewish. So we have siblings. We have two people who are really siblings rather than enemies. And the Christian church bears a heavy, heavy responsibility for anti-Semitism because of its anti-Judaism that has been pretty persistent. Something that we have to own up to. It's not a happy legacy, and we have to take responsibility for it. Happily, the Vatican Council in Nostra Aetate has made a huge step forward, and documents from Rome since that time have also been very, very good. So we're on a good track now, but we still shouldn't we shouldn't forget the past. I think the thing to do is to admit and to own the differences in interpretation that Christians give to the biblical books and the Jews give to the biblical books. And as I'm going to talk a little bit later, that's an official position of the Catholic Church because it's in the wonderful document in 2002, the Jewish people and their scriptures and the Christian Bible, which basically says the Jewish interpretation of the Bible is a possible one. In other words, it's legitimate. It's one that has legitimacy. So also is the Christian interpretation of the ancient scriptures. Why? Because both of them have antecedents in the ancient scriptures themselves. Christians point to the book of Daniel and to Zechariah and so on, where you have this apocalyptic view. Jews point to the mainstream part of the Old Testament or ancient scriptures, which don't have that perspective. And so both are legitimate in what they want to do. But the important point is to say Christians have not replaced Jews because God doesn't walk away from agreements made, and that agreement was there. And God is always there with people, even if they completely mess up their lives. God is there. I'm not saying the Jews have done that. It's just that God is always faithful to those whom he loves and will not turn his back on them. Okay, this maybe, yes, one question and then we'll have a 5-minute break if you can get more coffee.
Oh, thank you very much, Clifford. I'm just having a wild imagination as I listen to you. Looking at this story of Israel, I'm just wondering whether couldn't one say that the Israelites created their own God?
The Israelites created the what?
Created their own God, or dissatisfied with the gods around, and
well, I suppose you could say that in one sense, but in their understanding, the God whom they worship is the God who has revealed himself. The revelation is crucial. The one whom they worship is the one who stepped forward to them on several key times. First with Abraham and first to Abraham and to then Abraham's, the next 2 generations of Abraham's family, but in a crucial way in Exodus 3 and 4, when God meets Moses on the mountain and reveals to him the name Yahweh, which then becomes a kind of wordplay. I will be who I will be, or I am who I am, or I will, however you want to interpret that very mysterious thing. They would say the reason we worship the Lord is because the Lord has first revealed the Lord's self to them. They didn't create him. Now, a historian might say that obviously elements of their own experience entered into the way they conceptualized, of course. But they would still say the living one they worship is the one who stepped out of darkness and unknowability into their lives. So they would absolutely refuse to say that. And they would say about the pagans, these folks create images by pouring metal into molds and carving pieces of wood and then worshiping them. They are the ones that create their own gods, but we have a God who will not let an image be made of him, because no image could possibly even begin to capture the grandeur, the intimacy, the spaciousness of the God. So, but as a historian, of course, historians can say, sure, there are elements that are part of the divine being. We have to worship God and using our own experience and elements that strike us. So, yeah, that in a certain sense, we do have our own images of God that come out of ourselves. Yes, so one last question before.
What's the answer? What's the best thing to call?
Oh, the Old Testament? I use Old Testament, but then I slash Hebrew Bible. I think it's good to let people know that you're aware of the issue. And you can do that by giving a couple of designations. I think to say Old Testament all the time without without mentioning other things can give the impression that you're unaware that there's more than a little danger of seeing it as superseded. And that's the one thing that really you can't say. And it's the great temptation. The 2 that I mentioned, who think like I do, that's why I mentioned them, they would say, that's fine as long as you look upon old as revered, venerable, generative, which you should. And one of them said to me, I had an old aunt when I was growing up who was the most wonderful person I ever met, that I ever had, and she was so kind, gracious, helpful, that when I hear old, I just think of wonderful. So she said, if you think of old that way, you could use Old Testament. And I have a lot of Jewish friends who use Old Testament normally. I mean, they use it because it's in the air. It's,